Hello and welcome back to Stop the Press, our first episode for quite some time, a little sabbatical over Easter because of various holidays and difficulties with getting into the studio. But yes, we're back, and hello to everyone concerned. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Rob.
Hello, Nick.
Hello, Rob. And hello, Bill.
Did you have...
Hello, Nick.
Have we had a nice little sabbatical? Where did we do? What did we do?
Well, it seems like months. Well, it is months, isn't it? Even Easter seems like a long way away. I've been on holiday again. Turkey.
It's nice being retired, isn't it?
Yeah, I've been doing lots of, other stuff. Lots of cricket.
What's going on in your cricket life? Are you umpiring at the moment?
I am umpiring, yeah. Devon League panel umpire.
Nice.
Which means I'm appointed, by a panel to go and adjudicate games that between sides that I've got nothing to do with.
Do you do minor counties stuff yet?
No, I'm not that.
Not
senior.
quite that level yet. So
I do Devon Premier League.
Right. Okay. Good standard of cricket.
Yes, the highest level of club cricket in Devon.
Nice. Excellent. And what have you been up to, Nick?
In contrast, very little. Especially in contrast to my retired colleague on my right. I've only had one holiday in the last 2 months.
2 years.
I cycled with some cycling buddies of mine, and we cycled
I saw that.
up Mont Ventoux.
That's not nothing.
No, it's not nothing, no, but I wouldn't call it a holiday.
How long did it take you?
A fairer part of the day. And also cycled up Alpe d'Huez, which is one of the preeminent climbs in the Alpines in the Tour de France, usually.
It's what, 21 turns?
Correct, yeah. I forget all the gradients now. Probably an average gradient about 8%, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and it took its toll. Took its toll. And I'd probably do it again just to see if I could do it a bit quicker.
Did you have to stop?
How long?
Did you have to stop?
Numerous times, yes.
Did you?
Yeah.
Going wide around the outside of all of the turns.
But the stops were simply just to catch my breath and then get on again, basically. But it's I was stupid. I just didn't do enough of the proper type of training.
Right.
Next time, I'll know what to train for. So yeah.
So what time did you do Alpe d'Huez in, roughly?
I think it's probably measured in hours the minute. So I think it took about 2.5 hours, I think.
Do you want to know what the record? I've just looked it up.
Yeah, probably about 31 minutes, isn't it, or something?
36 minutes and 50 seconds. Marco Pantani.
Yeah. I got to turn 3 by then, I think.
Oh, unbelievable, these guys, aren't they? It is just unbelievable. Yeah, I just thought I'd look it up because we've got the Tour de France coming up, haven't we? In the next,
yes,
in the next few weeks. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm a big fan of the Tour de France.
I shall find my spot on the sofa and I'll be there for 3 weeks.
Yeah, I've been enjoying watching the Criterium on ITV4 this week just gone. Tadej looks unbeatable.
Yes.
Anyway, and I went to Germany to play some golf. And that was really amazing. Look, I played 3 really beautiful courses. One of which was we walked off one of the 16th green, I think it was, and as you walked off, you could see the snow-covered Alps in the background, like as if you could almost touch. It was just unbelievable. It was just absolutely beautiful courses, and because it's Germany, it was really cheap. It was only about 100 quid.
I was going to say Germany doesn't have that place in my mind as being the sort of home of.
They were amazing courses. I thoroughly recommend doing it before it becomes expensive, because it will become expensive. Those were 300 quid courses for 100 quid each in Germany. It was amazing. And we were given a guide by, guided around by our friend Andy, who is a German and lives in Munich. So we also went into Munich town centre on the day of the Champions League and saw the PSG fans doing their march towards the final. That was incredibly impressive. Quite scary, but really impressive. Really impressive. And all the Inter fans singing in the middle of the town. That was before the game, obviously.
Yeah.
Anyway, right. So today we've got quite an agenda ahead of us. We've got about 4 weeks of recording to do. And today we're going to do the BBC, starting with the past, present and future of the BBC. Episode 1, we're probably going to do we're going to do the past and as much of the present as we can get into, about half an hour. And then in episode 2, we'll do the present and then finish off with what we see as the future for the BBC and how it can maintain its place. Okay, so, guys, where do we all stand on the BBC? What's our current view of the BBC? Nick, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I will. big subject this. What my current views of the BBC? I feel slightly aggrieved that I'm paying the TV licence, but that's one point.
Why do you feel aggrieved?
Because, well, I don't actually watch broadcast live television anymore.
But do you use the BBC?
I do, yes.
So why do you feel aggrieved?
End of argument.
Yes.
Well, true. But I just feel aggrieved that I have to pay for something that I'm not really watching that much of, right?
I'll bet you pay for a lot of stuff that you don't use that much.
Possibly the gym mostly, but generally I've been feeling this way for quite a while now. But anyway, that's a separate point in terms of what that does for the BBC, because actually they are leaving the BBC as a subscriber base, or not subscriber, that's wrong, as a taxpayer in their droves. The great British public, 500,000 a year at the moment. In fact, it's going to climb even higher this year. Second point, I think the BBC is an institution. I think it's fundamentally linked to the British culture and character of how we are perceived, both internally but also externally to the rest of the world. I think that's clear, and I'd be worried what would happen if that wasn't in place, really. However, I also think the BBC has to evolve. I think the generation, as is currently, the youngest of which is Generation Z, and the one that will come after that, yet to be named, I think, see the BBC and broadcast television and live television as outdated. And I feel that the BBC can't ignore that, and they will have to change.
Didn't we, though, when we were young, did we really use the BBC for that much when we were young? It's like, don't people grow into the BBC? I think the BBC worry too much about what young people are doing.
I think they will grow into it, but the problem is if you've been brought up on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and other things like that, and Netflix, I'm not sure if you can evolve into the BBC.
But as you get older, your attention span grows. You're gonna get bored with YouTube and stuff.
Mine is getting shorter, and I'm definitely getting older.
Well, okay. And what about you, Bill? Where does the BBC stand for you?
Well, I think the BBC is one of the great institutions of British society. I think it's one of the great content-producing institutions of the world, and I think I completely agree with Nick that it's going to have to evolve in the future, and it's going to have to evolve very quickly, isn't it? Because its current charter runs out in 18 months' time, 2 years' time tops. They've just done this big survey, haven't they, of their whole subscriber base? Is what do you want the BBC to be? It'd be very interesting to look at the answer to that. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a bit like.
Did you do that survey?
I did.
I did that survey.
Yeah.
Did you? I felt the questions were quite loaded. Do you think the BBC continues to be a beacon of whatever it is in British society? You think, well,
you could easily.
Do I agree that it was a beacon in the first place?
Well, yes, but you could easily say no, couldn't you?
But I felt it was a bit loaded, that survey. It didn't feel completely neutral.
And some of the coverage around it was, reported as such, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It was a bias survey. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about BBC bias. But I think the BBC is capable of things that no other organisation that I'm aware of in the world is capable of. I think its funding model is unique. I mean, that's a massive question, isn't it, how that's going to go forward? Because in a competitive world, if it's going to have to compete with the streaming services and that sort of thing, and there's not a licence fee model, I'm not sure where the funding for something like BBC Bite Size comes through, or the World Service. These sort of massive things which you probably never use, I probably never use, but as you know.
But young people would. That's where they are engaging with the BBC. Bite Size is very well used in terms of GCSE revision and stuff.
Well, I think it's 80% of school children use it, don't they? It's a sort of free resource. Having said that, and I think it's brilliant that, and I know my kids definitely used it, but is that primary content? Is that what the BBC should be doing? I don't know.
That is a good question.
But I think the most important thing the BBC is that it is one of the great news producers in the world, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion about whether their news is biased or not. But I think it's an absolute beacon of proper reporting, responsible reporting in both difficult international, national, and I'm reluctant to say even in regional terms. You know, it's a standout news organisation now, in my mind.
Because, I mean, partly because it's well resourced. Because just as an example, we had a story that came out of Exeter College, out of our journalism course the other day, and we invited in the BBC and ITV to cover it, and they did. And the BBC came with 2 or 3 people in a team, sound, all of that type of stuff, and the ITV person came on their own, basically with a camera, which they had to set up on their own, etc., etc. It just spoke that the BBC has the resources to do things properly. So maybe, I don't know, that's a good thing, but is that us overfunding it at that point? Who knows? From my point of view, I agree with you, Bill. I think the BBC serves an unbelievable purpose. I think it's really important within Britain. I think it's really important within the world. I think if you look at what China are doing with trying to push out messages across the world and across Africa and stuff, I think the World Service is important to try and counteract the propaganda that's coming out of other sort of international broadcasters as much as anything. I think it's quite important that those messages come from a trusted source. We would trust it. I mean, a lot of people in this country have become cynical about how much you can trust the BBC, but certainly I think anyone who kind of understands the news and the BBC's place within the international community would certainly say that the BBC is a more trustworthy source than Chinese state radio.
Correct.
For instance. So I think the BBC serves a number of purposes.
Any broadcast service
Yes.
in the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because there's nothing to compare it. You know, there's nothing comparative.
What are you going to rely on otherwise? Fox News.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. So I come from that point of view that the BBC isn't just great, but I think it's really, really important and really, really important that we maintain it in some form and maintain the ability to push out those messages. Now, I read an article recently that the BBC is cutting back on the World Service and as a result is losing its place, is losing its primacy in some of those countries. I think that's dangerous.
I agree. I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, it's that sort of old-fashioned concept of, you know, that sort of very BBC voice and the actual brand of the BBC, you know, that I think still cuts through some of the noise that can be reported. You know, whatever issue it is that's being reported, whether it's Israel and Iran that's currently going on, whether it's Ukraine, wherever it is, that there's a certain aspect of BBC reporting that still, I think, is seen as being reliable and more credible than just about anything else. And I think increasingly, as you say, you know, with people, everyone capable now of publishing effectively whatever they want, and you can see the President of the United States effectively has his own platform, you know, Truth Social. He can say whatever he wants and repeatedly does.
And people believe him.
Well, of course they do. Of course they do. And then, you know, in the other, you know, these competitive platforms, and it doesn't matter where that is, whether that's TikTok or whatever it is, YouTube, wherever people are watching these highlights that are being edited and cut, and they can get away with extraordinary things. And I think the basis of proper reporting, you know, corroborated facts, both sides of the story, BBC sticks to that better than anyone I've seen.
I think that's an interesting point, by the way, about you mentioned about the BBC brand there, and that the BBC brand is ultimately a perception. It's created by the quality of the reporting, the history and the legacy of the quality of the reporting, the programmes they generally produce and generate. But it's also linked in there somewhere is how it's funded. You know, so knowing that it's coming from the taxpayer, not directly from the government, albeit it is in some way, indirectly perhaps, but it's coming from the taxpayer. It's publicly funded in that way. And the BBC brand is built around that as well. People know that. So if you took away that funding model, whilst the news quality might still be maintained, I think that brand might be dissipated in people's eyes over time. And you might start to question the integrity or the quality or the direction or the political bias of the BBC even more than you do currently. And I think that is a worry. If you took away the funding model, I know we're going to come on to that, but if you took that away, I think there's a real challenge around what the BBC becomes in the future, because it's unique at the moment because of how it's funded. And everyone says that, and it's a cliche, but it's true.
And I would like to focus a bit more on the present, as opposed we are drifting into how it might be funded in the future and all that stuff. And I think that's episode 2 of this for the moment. Let's get back to the point.
You can always edit that segment back into it.
It might be episode 6.
Yeah. Let's get back to the point. So just some facts. It was formed in 1922 by a group of radio manufacturers as a way of trying to regulate the industry, which was becoming increasingly chaotic, going down the sort of road that America had been going down at the time. In 1927, it was granted a royal charter and became the BBC as we know it today. I feel it worked. You know, if you look at the first 70 to 80 years of the BBC, we avoided in this country that chaotic, anything goes type atmosphere that America had. In the last 20 years or so, that feels like it's dissipated a little bit. But we'll come to that later. So my question for you is, given that history, given it's been going on since 1927, what's your earliest memory of the BBC? That's a big question. Look, big intake of breath from Bill. Go on then. What is your earliest memory?
Well, most of them are probably sport related. I think they're probably all sport related. If not, that is probably Blue Peter.
Yes. Children's television generally.
Yeah, I think children's television. And, you know, I think that's what people forget. There wasn't anything else to watch. Mm-hmm. You know, 2 channels when I was young. TV didn't come on till 4 o'clock.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and I
closed down during the day. Amazing, wasn't it?
In the day, you had that sort of strange girl sat with a clown. Was that BBC?
Yeah,
it was, wasn't it?
Test card.
The test card. And then, you know, finally children's TV would come on. And, you know, again, Blue Peter with this sort of massive brand at the middle of whatever else was on in TV that afternoon. The one that came up after that was John Craven's Newsround, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Neither of them were my favourite programmes, but they were absolute sort of anchors of afternoon children's TV, weren't they?
They were.
Which was 4 till 6?
Yeah.
Not even that, I don't think.
Well, yeah.
4 till 5:40, something like that.
I reckon it was 4 till 6 when it started, and then Neighbours came in and cut it to 4 till 5:30.
Hang on, the Flintstones before the Neighbours.
Well, that's still children's television, isn't it? But when Neighbours started, they cut children's television down to 2.5 hours as opposed to 3 hours at that point. Well, 1.5 hours rather than 2 hours at that point, I think.
So I reckon I can remember back to about 1975, 1976.
Same here.
So, you know, it's Test Card, Kids TV, Blue Peter, and then, of course, cricket, Tony Gregg.
Sunday afternoons.
Exactly.
John Player
League, Sunday afternoons, and Test matches, which back then cricket seemed to be on the TV all the time.
Yeah.
Which, of course, it was.
I used to score it. I had my own little scorebook, and I used to score the Test matches in John Player League.
Yeah, and me.
It was great.
Yeah. It was fantastic.
Such a sad loser as a child. But early memories is really cricket. You know, those West Indians running into bowl against the English in 1975 and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's me.
And the banana splits on the morning in the summer.
Yeah.
And the Magic Roundabout.
Magic Roundabout. There you go.
And the Clangers. Those 5 to 10 minute sort of children's programs. I remember loads of those. The Clangers and Magic Roundabout and Bagpuss. I hated Bagpuss. Everyone goes on about Bagpuss. Mr. Ben was great.
Deeply embedded into the psyche of people of our generation.
Absolutely. What about you, Nick, as a youngster?
Well, obviously it would have been children's programs as well. But since we talked about that, I'll skip
Button Moon, you said.
Button Moon, yes. But when you posed that question just now, after I'd already knew what you were going to say, 2 things came to mind. Now, ironically, I tend, because there was nothing else to do as a child other than watch kids' TV or play football outside, I tended to watch the news because my dad watched the news, right? And I ironically watched more news then when I was like 6 years old than I do now, to be honest.
Strange child.
So, no, exactly. So I probably know, back then I knew the names of all the MPs and politicians and members of parliament more than I do now as well. My first memory of the news back when I was a child was probably the Falklands War.
Right.
82, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously that was, headline news for weeks, wasn't it? And I remember watching that as a child.
Months.
months. Sorry, yes. So that was, and since we're here to talk about news as well, that was prime on my earliest memories. I'm sure there was something else before that, but that stands out.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, I do remember on the rare occasion where I got to stay up a little bit late, right, when BBC shut down.
Yeah.
I think it might have been 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 maybe. I'm not sure.
About 10:30 maybe. Yeah.
And they play the spinning globe on some random background, and then at some point the national anthem would play.
Yeah.
And the woman would say, "Now that's it. Go off to bed.
Everyone go to bed.
Right?
Right, you can all go to
Life
bed now.
stops now." So that's that. And obviously remember that because that was, you think, well, I'm up later than I should be. As a child, that stands out, of course. So.
But that's very indicative of a much quieter media world, wasn't it? Much quieter minds. Because that was it. That was it. It was go to bed.
Yeah.
Nothing else to do.
My earliest news thing, by the way, was the Iran siege, the Iran embassy siege. I remember cutting into kids' programs. I remember watching something like the Banana Splits or something, and they cut to the siege. I think that was late 70s because it was before the Shah was deposed, I think. So I think it was about 78 or something like that. So that's kind of my earliest news memory. And of course, Cup Final Day was a joy to behold. 11 o'clock in the morning, it's knockout in the afternoons and all of that type of stuff. It was amazing.
It's the knockout, yeah.
The BBC did sport really, really well at that point.
I've never watched the Cup Final.
You've never watched the Cup Final?
Never in my whole life.
Unbelievable.
Isn't it? Because when I was young, I was always playing cricket on Saturday afternoons.
Right.
And you'd always get picked because everyone else was watching the Cup Final.
Yeah.
And since, I'm not even sure it's on telly anymore, is it?
The Cup Final?
I know, I'm joking.
So, we kind of veered towards it, but what are our great moments? What are our things that we really remember the most about the BBC? What are the things... I know a lot of my character has been shaped by BBC comedy. If you listen to the way I speak around my friends, there is Monty Python and Blackadder and the Young Ones and all of that just interwoven into our speech patterns. To this day, we still kind of quote those programs and speak in a way that is kind of that irreverent sort of way. I feel the BBC has had that level of effect on my life that actually it has influenced the way I think and the way I behave and the way I speak about things. Not the news programs, but the actual that's comedy stuff.
That's definitely true, though, isn't it? I don't think my greatest moment or most memorable was always going to be Blackadder. And you'd say which series. I could go through each one of the series actually, with the exception probably of the first one, when I'd be able to quote you probably entire episodes.
Yeah,
almost, or certainly. Which it reflects the BBC in many ways, doesn't it? One is the sort of excellence of the production that went into it, the concentration on writing and the quality of the comedy that they did. But also the fact, that because there was originally 2, then there were 3 or 4, weren't they? Or, at one point we may have had 10 channels that were available to us. Because the choice was so much less, these things were burnt into our minds, weren't they?
9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, Young Ones, everyone was in front of the telly.
Everyone watched it.
From my school, anyway.
Everyone watched it. And whatever was on Sunday night at 8 o'clock, and even when I was first going to work, that's the thing, everyone would have watched it.
Yeah.
That was it.
And the BBC was experimental back then as well. Things like Monty Python, you wonder whether they'd ever get made nowadays. You wonder whether not the 9 o'clock news would get made. Even Blackadder, you wonder whether it would get made nowadays. Let me pitch you a thing about a guy who isn't really very famous in the old days, who's a bit of a failure, who's got a dog's body who assists him, and is servant to the Prince Regent or servant to the King. It's like, well, you're going to have to sell it to me, aren't you?
Well, I mean, it would get made because of the quality of the writing, wouldn't it? I mean, was it Ben Elton and
Richard Curtis?
The script was just incredibly brilliant, funny like you wouldn't believe, But I think you're right. I think the BBC at the time were pioneers of alternative comedy. There was mainstream comedy, which was obviously the preserve of BBC One and probably ITV, right? Palladium performers and punchlines.
Two Ronnies, Little and Large.
We all love it. We all love it, but you were aware even at the time that it was quite staid.
Yeah.
But the BBC Two comes along, and pioneers it, ultimately with Young Ones, which was obviously the pinnacle of, at the time, alt comedy. But then you also had, what else you had, was spin-offs from that. You had the
Filthy Rich and Cat Flap was amazing.
Correct, yeah, and the Comedy Store, and it just literally steamrolled from there, didn't it?
Yeah.
And to the point where we are now with comedy. So that, I think,
to be honest, I feel
has,
we've gone backwards with comedy since like the 80s.
It's hard to find, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, because so much of comedy has been done, isn't it? People have tried to get funnier by being more and more extreme, or, so you've ended up with some comedians who I think are so dreadful, I'm not even going to mention them. The art of those very funny sort of sitcom writing seems to have gone out the window, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely sitcom.
There's funny comedians out there, but it feels like there's not much in the way of sitcoms. Sitcoms now have become dramas, really. There's not much laughing. There's a lot of smile humour, as opposed to actual laughing humour nowadays.
And it's interesting as well that you're all about how BBC has altered or affected our growing up and our culture and that sort of thing. And for me, the one that stands out is Christmas Day. Christmas Day now is a bit of a bore and a bit of a yawn for me. But back when I was growing up, and
you've got 3 children.
Once they've opened their presents, it then becomes a bore and a yawn. Right? But
let's make sure they all hear this.
Yeah, no. But in the mid to late 80s, and then obviously into the mid to late 90s, Christmas Day was obviously a usual Christmas Day fare. But then it was about what was the special on the TV that afternoon, and then into the evening, and essentially, you just got around the telly and watched those specials.
You had dinner, and then you watched the telly until you fell asleep, basically.
Yeah, and that was, that I still think about Christmas Day in that way.
And you only
reality is nothing like it now. So,
and you only watched the BBC.
Correct.
It was like I didn't know anyone who really watched anything on ITV.
But that reflects the death of linear TV, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it does.
Because now you've got the choice in the afternoon. You can either sit down and watch the Wizard of Oz, which of course I will always do, or you can go upstairs, sit in your bedroom, and watch series 3 of Yellowstone. Well, on your own.
But on Christmas Day, there was always a movie. There was a premiere. It had been in the cinema 5 years ago, and it was only got on telly on that day. So it was everyone watched that movie.
Was. Yeah.
Now you can watch any movie whenever you want, even before it even hits the cinema, to be honest.
I think it was more than one movie, wasn't it? There was always one in the morning.
Exactly.
There was always like a really good one in the morning.
Yeah.
Sort of
a kids one, so they were out of your hair while you were cooking the lunch and stuff. Yeah. What happened on the BBC on Christmas Day 1986?
Ooh.
Do we remember?
No.
86. Nothing much happened in the world in 86.
Den served Angie with divorce papers, and the BBC had the biggest audience they've ever had.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What was that, 25 million?
For a drama. Yeah, it was something like 30 million people tuned in to watch Den serve Angie with divorce papers.
But if you think about, you said BBC was pioneering. If you think what a brave decision that was to commission EastEnders to take on Coronation Street.
Yes.
I don't think anyone can remember how massive Coronation Street was. Again, that's a whole other episode, isn't it? We could talk about Coronation Street. You and I grew up in a Coronation Street house. Mum and Dad watched it; they still do. And suddenly, EastEnders come up with this slightly sort of violent. I mean, it wasn't quite sweary, but it almost felt sweary, didn't it?
And more contemporary, gay relationships and all of that type of stuff.
Lots
more black people in it. All of that type of stuff.
Much more reflective of modern day Britain, I think.
Well,
yes.
Certainly the BBC would try to be. They kind of
bet the farm on that, didn't they? Really, because it was such an audience grabber, Corrie, wasn't it? Then I remember that EastEnders coming out and the trailer for it. I remember they introducing the characters, and they had to do something that was a complete contrast to Coronation Street. It had to be the black to their white and the chalk to their cheese, didn't they?
Yeah, it was genius.
It was,
think, and again, it required a lot of nerve holding, didn't it? The commissioners and the writers and producers and all that, because it was slated to start with, wasn't it?
As anything new is.
Yeah, because it wasn't Coronation Street, was it? But, all within 4 months, we were all hooked.
Yeah. I still can't understand.
I watched it for years.
No, I haven't.
I watched it for about 3 or 4 years and I haven't watched it since, I don't think. I still can't understand why El Dorado wasn't of the same ilk.
I was going to say El Dorado.
So it wasn't
was that
the
sailing
BBC
one?
haven't been amazing all the time. That was Howard's Way,
Howard's
wasn't
Way.
it? Yeah.
Eldorado's one was like the expats in like Mallorca or something, wasn't it? And they all...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Howard's Way was the Sunday night. There was always a Sunday night one. There's Howard's Way, and there was Lovejoy and stuff like that. The sort of cosy early Sunday evening type stuff, wasn't it? Yeah. Getting back to the journalism side of things, I've made some notes of great moments in the BBC and where they've served the country the best. And I've obviously come up with Churchill's addresses during the war. I've come up with things like Desert Island Discs, which has gone on forever, and TMS, which I think is a national treasure. And then I mentioned some of the comedy and stuff. But talking about sort of Churchill and stuff, it feels like the BBC was always there for us in moments of trouble as well. Like we relied on the BBC to make us feel a bit better, to make us understand what was going on, to make sure that things weren't overblown and over-exaggerated, etc., as a news thing, but we knew what was going on. I can think of Churchill, but I can also think of the Falklands War and many, many other times where the BBC has been what we have looked at. Things like the coronation as well. Do you think...
Can you remember that?
I don't remember it, but I've done my research. I'm aware that that's what people did. And the World Cup
has
final.
been one that you probably can remember now.
Yeah. Well, I remember the Falklands War. And I remember
that
9/11
very
clearly.
Very clearly, Mrs. Thatcher coming out of number 10.
I remember that.
And speaking in that really odd voice she had, wasn't she? She kept saying, it's rejoice, wasn't it, was the word. And it felt extraordinarily important. There was a sort of huge sense of relief and happiness, actually, that we'd won.
Yeah. That was a risk, wasn't it? But the BBC covered it, and we got what we needed from the BBC at that point, as opposed to the Sun, which sensationalised it and was gung ho and stuff, and all of the other papers and stuff. The BBC was where we knew we'd get the facts and stuff. Things like Hillsborough, the BBC covered incredibly well. I remember crying on the day of Hillsborough. It was because I was such a football fan. I remember it being something that really affected me. And the coverage on the BBC was absolutely outstanding that day. It's where we went. And then 9/11 happened. And for me, at least, I found myself watching Sky. It was the first time that a really big thing had happened where I didn't naturally progress to the BBC. I started by flicking and I ended up nesting on Sky. And I think it was because it felt like they understood what the consequences of this were more, or were able to conject a bit more, whereas the BBC were a bit hamstrung by their rules. How did you feel about that?
I certainly didn't notice that, but then I was probably approaching it from a different space because, of course, we were reporting it ourselves. So, the BBC and all the other news channels then were important sources of information for us as well. I didn't notice the change that you mentioned there. I think maybe post that we felt ourselves in a different media environment, and it might have been the time when somebody like Sky really came to the party as a major player.
Yeah,
their coverage certainly stood up, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
In the sort of in one of the biggest story of my lifetime, no doubt about that.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
But I don't think the BBC lost anything there. If anything, I think the BBC brand has suffered a bit as a result of some of the scandals recently, which I think has only affected the brand, even though that's, it's got no relevance to the impartiality or the credibility of their news coverage, is it?
No.
So I didn't notice that around 9/11.
What did you think, Nick?
No, I didn't notice that either. But one thing struck me as you were talking then, because obviously it was an evolving story, wasn't it? That was still evolving for weeks afterwards, if not months. And I just thought to myself, when did 24-hour news coverage come into the UK? And obviously it was in America way before us. But I'm just thinking, did people gravitate to Sky because they had more, consistent coverage?
I think that might have been it.
I'm just wondering if that played a part. I mean, I don't remember who I went to, Sky or BBC, to be honest. But but I'm just, that seems relevant to me that we moved as a consumer to, constant information.
Yeah, and I think maybe it marked a sort of real step into the sort of globalization of content, news content as well. And I think Sky were much more ready to sort of use American news anchors or American, do you know what I mean? Or some of those American techniques that have been honed over years of 24/7 publishing.
And maybe that's what I was sort of gravitating towards. Maybe I felt like it just was more on it. Maybe the images came in faster, the comment came in faster from the people on the spot, etc. So just looking it up, Sky News launched in the UK on February the 5th, 1989, and BBC News 24 launched on November the 9th, 1997.
Oh, right.
So both were in place by then.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's a good moment to finish our reverie on the past and present of the BBC. And we'll be back in our next episode to talk a little bit more about the future of the BBC. Thank you for listening. This has been Stop the Press.